Good evening to you all. My research on the National Historical Museum forms part of an EU-funded project entitled European National Museums, UNAMUS, Identity Politics, the Uses of the Past, and the European Citizen. The project began in 2010 and will be completed by the end of this year. The academic institutions participating in the program may be seen on the slide here. Amongst them, the Department of Cultural Technology and Communication, University of the Aegean, with Dr. Alexandra Bounia, Assistant Professor of Museology, acting as the project partner on behalf of our institution. Dr. Bounia is in the audience tonight, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank her for kindly inviting me to take part in the UNAMUS research team. In the official website of UNAMUS, the main aim of the project is described as follows. The project explores the creation and power of European national museums. The focus is on understanding the conditions for using the past in negotiations that recreate citizenship and on the understanding of layers of territorial belonging. The research is conducted through multidisciplinary collaboration between 8 leading university institutions. Project partners and associated researchers explore a variety of themes such as institutional path dependencies, the handling of conflicts, modes of representation, cultural policy, and visitors' experiences. The project has been divided into 6 work packages, plus the work packages of management and dissemination. My own research was part of work package 3 entitled Uses of the Past, Narrating the Nation and Negotiating Conflicts. This research strand examined how national identity is built and reinforced through reference to the past, as well as the use of this past in national museum exhibitions. The basic principle, or rather the conceptual point of departure of this enterprise, has been that the authoring on national identity, in our case Greek national identity and history, cannot be perceived as a monolithic phenomenon or an all-embracing narrative, but instead as a highly complex and diverse ideology consisting of various, heterogeneous, and in certain respects even incompatible readings of nationhood. In an attempt to further substantiate this point, the project accorded a surplus of analytical weight to the exploration of the historical program of each museum, the in-depth examination of the disciplinary and museographic types adopted by the exhibition curators to enhance their vision of national history, and finally, to the collection of information concerning the strategies of display and methods of visualization employed during each exhibition. One of the case studies considered for the purposes of Work Package 3 was the first exhibition hosted at the National Historical Museum of Athens in 1884. Its full title was Exhibition of the Monuments of the Holy Struggle. Έκθεσης μνημείων του Ιερού Αγώνος. The curatorial work of this project was undertaken by the historian Konstantinos Paparigopoulos. Let me begin by providing some very general information as regards the broader historical context within which we ought to situate not only the establishment of the National Historical Museum, but also its first exhibition. This inevitably takes us back to the period of the Greek Revolution at the very onset of the 19th century. The Revolution of Greece in 1821 was one of the few 19th century revolutions that resulted in the formation and concretization of a new nation-state, despite its peripheral position. Greece was both politically and geographically peripheral at the time. Any investigation of this success, the success of the Greek national project, ought to take into serious account its full dependence upon the construction of a historical model which elevated in importance classical antiquity. This model was essentially both of local and European origin. The ideal the vision of the classical past acted as a mirror in which both Greece and Europe could contemplate their imagined selves. Therefore, in a way, Hellenization may be seen as tantamount to Europeanization and vice versa. As Goethe argues, for the Greeks, the affinity with the classical past was the only title of honor they could use in their effort to consolidate a distinctive national identity. In this affinity, the Greeks saw the ideological and political justification for the existence of a Greek state after 4 centuries of Ottoman rule, and Europe found a moral justification for its intellectual debt to the Greeks. Greece gained independence in 1830. After the assassination of Ioannis Kapodistrias, the first governor of the Greek state, the great powers of Russia, France, and Great Britain imposed the Bavarian Prince Otto I as king. Largely influenced by the classicist atmosphere of the royal court in Munich, Otto and his Bavarian court were determined to restore Greece to a condition worthy of ancient precedent. Through a process of acculturation that continued to emphasize the Hellenic as opposed to the Romaic, Byzantine dimension of Greek identity, Greeks began to internalize deeply a Hellenic national identity that coexisted with, but took precedence over, the Romaic one. The strong appeal of the past played a decisive role in the objectification of the state, and around that time Athens was reinstated as the capital of Greece, in 1833, a year after the establishment of the modern Greek state. This was also the time that archaeology became what Goethe calls the national discipline par excellence, and was invested with significant ideological and political value. The 2 main agents of archaeological activity, namely the Greek Archaeological Service and the private Archaeological Society, were founded as early as 1833 and 37 respectively. A symbolic restoration of the Parthenon also began at the time, and it was there that the coronation of King Goethe took place in 1835, with an impressive public ritual, rife with symbolism and political significance, bringing together in one act the king, antiquities, the nation, its past and future, ancient Greece and modern Europe. Still in the 1930s, and while Greece was striving to strengthen the connection between the classical past and the modern state, German philologist Jakob Philipp Fallmerayer produced several publications claiming that modern Greeks had no biological relation to ancient Greeks, as they were heavily mixed up with the Slavs from the 6th century AD onwards. The legacy of classical antiquity was thus portrayed as belonging to the West, of which modern Greeks were not a part. As Livanius argues, Fallmerayer's claim that massive Slavic invasions of the Byzantine Empire had led to the racial disappearance of the Greek population of the Peloponnese came as a stupendous shock to the newly minded Greek nationalism. His theories attacked many targets. By depicting the Greeks of his day as descendants from the Slavs, he not only deprived modern Greeks of their foremost source of pride and equated them with lesser breeds, like the Slavs, but removed their European credentials as well. For if they are not linear descendants of the glory that was Greece, then they had no real place in European civilizations. The entire ideological credo of both Greeks and European Philhellenism seemed to be suddenly turning into a castle of mud, swept over by the Slavic tidal wave of the Middle Ages. You may also find interesting the following passage by Warwoodis, considering the unequaled impact of this work upon the development of Neolithic national culture. The fact that it was not translated into Greek for 150 years testifies in itself to the practically hysterical resistance that greeted it. Indeed, within the traditional domain of modern Greek letters, the name Fallmerayer had achieved a virtually satanic signification. Attempts to refuse Fallmerayer's theory had a long-lasting effect on Greek intellectual circles. For the next few decades, Greeks responded to the aforementioned challenge in a number of ways. An immediate consequence was the sudden flowering of folklore studies, history, philology, and language studies, all central to the institution of modern Greek national culture. If the biological link between modern Greeks and their ancient predecessors was broken, their cultural link would have to be proven. Thus, history, archaeology, and early folk studies embarked on a plan to bring to light evidence of the unbroken evolution of the Greek nation from antiquity down to the 19th century. A reappraisal of Byzantine heritage initially, and then of that of modern Hellenism, was an indispensable historical requirement for the aspirations of the state and its intelligentsia. Around the same time, this historical requirement had begun to gain considerable ground and widespread support in the political scene, particularly through the emergence of the so-called Great Idea. In 1843, a revolt against King Goethe led to the establishment of a constitution. The constitution, proclaimed in March 1844, came from the workings of the 3rd of September National Assembly of the Hellenes in Athens, and was a constitutional pact between the monarch and the nation. The speech delivered before the First Constitutional Assembly by Ioannis Koletis, a powerful politician of the period in question, is of fundamental historical importance, for it argued explicitly for the expansion of political boundaries of Greece to fit a territory he associated with Byzantine Hellenism and its capital city, Constantinople. The Kingdom of Greece is not Greece. Greece constitutes only one part, the smallest and poorest. A Greek is not only a man who lives within this kingdom, but also one who lives in Yanina, in Salonika, in Ceres, in Andrianople, in Constantinople, in Smyrna, Trepizod, Crete, Samos, and in any land associated with Greek history or the Greek race. There are two main centers of Hellenism: Athens, the capital of the Greek kingdom, and the city, the polis, Constantinople, the dream and hope of all Greeks. All foregoing efforts, however, did not end up sufficiently bridging the gaps of recent and distant history. In 1852, the historian Spiridon Zabellios expressed the hope that the scattered and torn pieces of our history would eventually be articulated and acquire completeness and unity. In a similar vein, in 1872, the philosopher Petros Vrailas Armenis claimed that for fully appreciating the historical past of Greece, it would be necessary to examine the ways Greece is related to its preceding Oriental world, the influence it exercised on the Romans, its relation to Christianity, what happened to Greece in the Middle Ages, in which ways Greece contributed to the Renaissance, how it contributed to contemporary civilization, how and why Greece survived till our times, although it was enslaved, how it resurrected itself, what its mission is today. Konstantinos Paparigopoulos embarked on the exploration of all these themes and questions, and it was him who ultimately managed to accomplish the task of producing a totalizing history. In 1851, he became professor of history in the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, and almost a decade later, in 1860, published the monumental work History of the Hellenic Nation from the Ancient Times until the Modern, in which he brought under a single narrative several chronological phases of the nation. Largely drawing upon the work of Spiridon Zabellios, Paparigopoulos essentially argued that there was a direct and unbroken history of the Greek nation divided into three phases: classical, Byzantine, and modern, each of which built upon the other. The constitution of the unity of Greek history was thus created in the form of a linear narrative. The innovation in Paparigopoulos' work lies in the fact that it reifies Greek history and organizes it around a main character, even though this character acquires a different meaning during each period. he introduces the terms first Macedonian, Christian, medieval, and modern Hellenism. The first Hellenism was ancient Hellenism, that is the classical Hellenism that declined after the Peloponnesian Wars. It was succeeded by Macedonian Hellenism, which was actually a slight transformation of the first. This one was followed by Christian Hellenism, which was later replaced by medieval Hellenism, which brought modern Hellenism to life in the 13th century. Under this scheme, Greeks could profess to be both Eastern and Western, at once laying claim to the legacy of ancient Greece as well as the Byzantine Orthodox Christian tradition. And although his predecessors employed the third person in referring to their object, Paparrigopoulos imposed and extensively used we and us in order to describe all Greeks of the past. By doing so, he portrayed the readers and also encouraged them to perceive themselves as transhistorical national subjects. His appropriation of Byzantine history changed the content of Greek national identity on yet another level. Essentially, Paparrigopoulos transformed the narrative from one that had been imported by them, the Europeans, into one that was produced locally by us, the Greeks. This modification acquired the features of a revolt against the dominant view of the national self, for it marked the shift of the writing of national history from outside to inside the nation, as well as the move from intellectual elites to the ordinary people. It is for all the above reasons that Paparrigopoulos is often portrayed as a national historian who outlined the modern Greek heritage through the authoring of the Race's Gospel, that is the history of the Greek nation. Paparrigopoulos' curatorial work at the National Historical Museum forms yet another explicit manifestation of his greater nationalistic vision. The National Historical Museum belongs to the Historical and Ethnological Society of Greece, which was an idea inspired from Nikolaos Politis and founded as an institution in 1882 for the purpose of collecting, saving, and presenting relics and documentary evidence relating to modern Greek history. Let me just point out here that a more general and steadily growing interest for modern Greek history manifested itself at the time, and this is not only evidenced by the foundation of the Ethnological and Historical Society, but also the establishment of the Christian Archaeological Society in 1884, and later, in 1808, the foundation of the Greek Folk Society. From 1883 onwards, the Historical and Ethnological Society also began to publish a scientific journal, το Δελτίον της Ιστορικής και Εθνολογικής Εταιρείας της Ελλάδος, comprising studies and articles on Greek history and folklore. Apart from Nikolaos Politis, the first members to be registered in the society were prominent members of the Athenian intelligentsia, publishers, historians, authors, ethnographers, philologists, and journalists. According to the founding statement of the Eteria, composed and signed by all its founding members in 1882, its main aim was the collection of historical and ethnological written sources and material culture contributing to the illumination of the middle and late stages of Greek history, philology, folklore and language through the establishment of a museum and an archive that would encompass all foregoing monuments of national life, του εθνικού βίου. The goals, as defined by the Society statement, were of fundamental importance, for this was essentially the first time that a museum was exclusively devoted to the visualization and display of Neo-Hellenism, thus bringing to the fore the history of the late medieval period, the Ottoman occupation, as well as the early years of the Greek state. The Society's founding statement mentions that the National Historical Museum had to be envisaged as a project following contemporary European examples, like Kensington Museum in London, Hôtel de Cluny in Paris, the Germanisches Museum and the Kunstgewerbe Museum in Germany. Apart from the support of the actual members, this effort was supported from its very outset by an even greater circle of intellectuals, including artists, scientists, journalists and publishers, as well as governmental officials and the municipality of Athens. Support was either financial or realized through the generous provision of relics and manuscripts, considered to be of historical national importance, and all those could be subsequently be used as exhibits. Subsequently refers to the fact that initially the collection had to be accommodated in the houses of several members of the Eteria. However, as the collection increased in quantity, it became imperative to transfer all items to a basement room of the Greek Parliament. In 1883, the historian Spyridon Lambros, founding member of the Society, took the initiative to propose to the mayor of Athens, Dimitrios Soutsos, the transfer of the collection from the basements of the Greek Parliament to the Polytechnion, the National Technical University of Athens. The transfer coincided with the first temporary exhibition of the collection to the public. The great success of the event triggered a series of actions on behalf of the Society, aiming at the permanent display of the collection and the obtainment of a building that would serve precisely for this purpose. In August 1884, the Prime Minister Harilaos Trikoupis bestowed Hall 24 in the Polytechnion, while the Ministries of Military, Maritime and Religious Affairs granted portraits and weapons of heroes of the Revolution, which were previously stored in the Acropolis Museum. However, the capacity of Hall 24 was disproportionate to the steadily increasing number of exhibits and visitors, so a need for a more spacious environment continued to be an issue of great concern. In July 1895, the Greek Minister of Education, Angelos Vlachos, granted a larger hall of the Polytechnion to the Society. An exhibition was organized, and its opening coincided with the first Olympic Games, which were hosted in Athens in 1896. In subsequent decades, much effort was invested in guaranteeing a permanent basis for the collection. In 1935, the possibility of using the old Parliament building was advanced for the first time. However, this was only materialized 25 years later, in 1960. During the Second World War, all exhibition items were packed and stored in basement rooms of the university building as well as private houses. With the termination of warfare in Greece, the Society rented temporarily Stegia Poron Korasidon, a building located at the city center of Athens, where a cursory exhibition in the form of an accessible storage room rather than museum was set up. In 1960, the official decision was made to transfer the Society's collection in the old Parliament Megaron in Stadiou Street. In 1961, the building underwent major restoration, and from this period onwards, it permanently accommodates the National Historical Museum. With the actual members of the Society sharing the consensus that the National Historical Museum, for most part of its early history, did not really operate as a museum, but instead as a visible storage space, no concise information can be found in the extant body of literature and archival material with regard to the strategic handling, organization and setup of the collection for exhibition purposes. Nevertheless, and thanks to the great help and support of Mrs. Papaspirou, Director of the National Historical Museum, and Mrs. Papanastasiou, Curator of the Historical Archives Collection, I managed to collect important material for all the exhibitions hosted at the Polytechnion, which were 5 in total. Unfortunately, the photographic material from the Polytechnion exhibitions that I have at my disposal was not accompanied by any additional information that could securely identify the photographs corresponding to each exhibition, with the possible exception of the photograph you see on this slide. It appears, nevertheless, that the logic behind the setting of all these early exhibitions of the collection was more or less the same, as you can see from the slide here. As already mentioned above, in 1883, Spiridon Lambros proposed to the mayor of Athens the transferring of the Eteria's collections to the Polytechnion. The main aim of the exhibition would be to illuminate different socio-historical aspects of the Greek Polygenesia, in other words, the rebirth of the Greek nation. The expectation also was that the organization of a formal exhibition of the collection would encourage, and thus potentially increase, further donations of relics and written documents from individuals and institutions. It is noteworthy that Lambros suggested that the opening of this exhibition should take place on March the 25th of the following year, 1884, the date officially recognized as the anniversary of the Greek Revolution. His proposal was accepted with great enthusiasm, and a committee was soon thereafter established in cooperation with the Philological Society of Parnassos for overseeing the exhibition's organization. All individuals and families possessing relics from the War of Independence were invited to make offerings for the exhibition. The exhibits, 1,100 in total, were divided into 4 main categories. Category 1, inscriptions, paintings and sculptures. 2, weapons. 3, manuscripts and documents. And 4, various costumes, furniture and other items of their everyday life. A detailed catalogue of the exhibition was also composed, in which all items were described, while the exhibitors, be that the society itself or the private donors, were also acknowledged. Although the catalogue was edited by the Society and the Parnassos Philological Society, the welcoming speech during the museum's opening ceremony was delivered by the curator Konstantinos Paparigopoulos. The relics offered by families and individuals for the purposes of the exhibition remained in the hands of the Eteria. Enthusiastic reports concerning the exhibition can be found in the press of that year, and for this reason, in the Society's General Assembly that took place right after the opening of the exhibition, the President stressed the following: "This exhibition, visited by millions of Athenians, brought profound enthusiasm to all Greeks, but also activated the memory of the pan-Hellenic struggles and the honor of those who fought for the Greek nation." The historical context, as well as the curatorial vision of Paparigopoulos and the Eteria as a whole, were certainly 2 key factors that had contributed immensely to the success of this exhibition. However, this new middle-class intelligentsia of Greek nationalism also had to invent ways of inviting the masses into history, and as Smith has rightly indicated, this invitation card had to be written in a language that people could understand. For a national hegemony to be achieved, plausible points of identification had to be provided, rather than being enforced by an elite to a helpless mass. Quite on the contrary, such elites ought to construct, if not reconstruct, a conceptual language within which members of pre-existing ethnic, linguistic, religious, political and other communities may feel able to express a sense of collective belonging. I think that in a way, this critical issue was amongst the main epistemological concerns for all research teams working for UNAMO's Work Package 3. As a result, our work was not limited to an approach that would link in top-down fashion nationalism, national museum exhibitions, and the visitors of these exhibitions. Rather, this triptych was treated as an arena of incomplete signification, to quote Derrida. What emerges as an effect in such contexts of incomplete signification is a turning of boundaries and limits into in-between spaces, through and within which the meanings of culture, politics, authority and belonging may be negotiated and constantly reshaped. With these points in mind, let us return to the exhibition of the monuments of the Holy Struggle. If we attempted to identify contexts contexts of a complete signification, as the ones described above, then the first one, in this particular case study, would have to focus on the concept of space. As already discussed above, a major source of concern for all members of the Eteria had been to find a space for the accommodation and permanent exhibition of its collection. In unison, however, the Eteria aimed for yet another space. It strived to extend the temporal frontiers and enlarge the historical space of the Greek nation by broadening its scope so as to include the periods prior to and after the revolution. This was achieved through reference to ordinary people and their own contribution to the making of national history. I already mentioned earlier that the study of ordinary people and their lives became a widely recognized and a highly promising research field in Greece at the time. The premises of this new discipline were basically to prove that 19th century Greeks were the direct descendants of ancient Greeks and to recognize elements of such continuity in the modern Greek folk culture. As Lukatos argues, folklore thus became a truly national discipline because it told the nation, "Know thyself." Nikolaos Politis, founder of the Historical and Ethnological Society, but interestingly also of modern Greek folk studies, considered as an issue of pivotal importance the search for kinship between our own manners and customs and those of the ancient Greeks, or what he termed the continuation of a former life. Under this conceptual framework, the nation became something that people shared and carried through the centuries. It was also something that could be guaranteed only through the active participation of all national subjects in its safeguarding. What is important to examine in this respect is the obvious surplus of emphasis accorded to the heroic image in the exhibition of the monuments of the Holy Struggle. This is not from the exhibition, the early exhibition, but nevertheless, it's the armor of Theodoros Kolokotronis. During the late stages of 19th century, warriors and heroes living on turbulent borders were celebrated throughout Europe. Only a few years earlier than the exhibition, the Genis Akritas was published, the story of the eponymous Byzantine warrior who fought to preserve the Hellenic Christian state of Byzantium from ceaseless incursions, rage and oppressions of harsh tyrants of another race, to uphold and extend freedom and justice for the people. For Nikolaos Politis, the Acritic epic was the national epic of all modern Greeks. To put the matter in its appropriately proud context, and those are Politis' words, in the Genis Akritas, the desires and ideals of the Hellenic nation reached their peak, because in this man, the long centuries of ceaseless struggle by the Hellenic against the Ottoman world are symbolized. From the 1880s, analogies were increasingly drawn between the Genis heroic exploits and the heroic deeds of the War of Independence. The commemoration of the heroes of the Revolution, who against all odds carved an independent Greek kingdom out of the Ottoman Empire, merged within an idealization and moved general affirmation of the values of bravery, sacrifice, commitment, and the protection of national Greek space. So, if we take the point that national history was presented as a collectivized project through its link with folklore studies, and if, on the other hand, the safeguarding of national space was also presented as a collectivized effort, requiring and at the same time celebrating active engagement, commitment, sacrifice, and so forth, a third bridge constructed between the nation and its subject in this particular exhibition had to do with the fact that this was a project which relied heavily upon donations. Susan Pierce once suggested that to give material freely to museums is an act which conveys famous immortality. To donate to a worthy museum ensured that such an act remained visible in perpetuity and secured a lasting connection between person and object. In doing so, donors retained symbolic ownership of the exhibits, and this, according to Peirce, brings to mind what Annette Weiner calls the paradox of keeping while giving. Even if this is the case, however, another effect of such acts is that keeping while giving, the very idea of inalienable value, does not merely aim to status recognition and individual reputation. The very act of offering family relics to a national museum may in fact imply that this is an act of giving which guarantees the keeping, the very maintenance of the national body through the coexistence, the collective display, or if you wish, the rearticulation of its material components. This feeling of communion, sharing and belonging is further reinforced by the conscious and explicit investment on behalf of the curator and the society as a whole in establishing a direct correlation between the exhibition and Greek Orthodox religion. For instance, as already mentioned earlier, when Spiridon Labros proposed to the mayor of Athens the organization of the exhibition at the Polytechnion, he also claimed that the latter would lionize Greek polygenesia, a term which evoked the Christian notion of resurrection after the fall. The notion of the fall, as well as death and resurrection, so common in Christian tradition, occupied a prominent role in the Greek national narrative and were also addressed through the exhibition's narrative. Put simply, what the visitors of the Society's collection could experience in full measure upon arrival in the area of the exhibition was how, after the fall, the Greek nation resurrected itself in its former glory. Equally indicative is the use of the word holy in the very title of the 1884 exhibition, essentially implying that the survival of the Greek nation and its people through time constituted a sacred battle. Also noteworthy is that at the center of the main room of the exhibition, a large inscription was placed, inscribed with the words "Sanctum of the Liberators of the Greek Nation," in an obvious attempt to add further force to the ecclesiastic aura of the museum's collection. Finally, several interesting religious terms and expressions are found in documents written by members of the Society. In one of these, it is mentioned that by entering the museum, visitors could breathe the air of freedom and experience a pure enthusiasm of patriotism, a feeling comparable to the Holy Communion. In 1887, therefore, Konstantinos Rados calls the museum a shrine, ιερό προσκύνημα. All the above information indicates how the ceremonial elements of Orthodox Christianity were adopted by both the curators and the visitors of the collection, while the actual exhibits of the Society were supposed to be approached in a manner very similar to the worshipping of Christian icons. It is for this reason that the visit to the exhibition has been described as a sacred pilgrimage to the nation's history. The objects of the exhibition, we could say, were therefore not historical data in the strict sense of the word, as they provided little information in themselves. They had value because of the hands that touched them and the events they witnessed. Estia, an Athenian journal of the 19th century, portrays this tendency very eloquently. In the museum, one may find furniture touched by the hands of our great fathers. While our great fathers were preparing the conditions for the resurrection of Greece, these furniture, these materialities, acted as humble but precious supporters of great thinkers and great ideas. Following a point made recently by Bodenstein, the meaning of these objects therefore was activated by those who contemplated them. The emotional potential of these objects was heightened by the fact that they provided little or no other information that could distract the visitor from his or her sentimental experience. This was a discursive void, according to Bodenstein, a moment owing not so much on history and not perceiving history as a rational process, but rather as memory, identity, or even more as an emotional effect commonly described in contemporary social theory and material culture studies as an affective reaction. By viewing the nationalist narrative with additional stories, images, materials, memories, experiences, and feelings, the curatorial agenda, the visitors, and the objects in unison produced a highly versatile and multilayered narrative which further reinforced national belonging and the perception of the past as a continuous, undisrupted, almost objectified historical sequence. The density of objects and meaning in this small, dark place of the exhibition produced a feeling of death, mourning, and melancholy, but also gave hope for renaissance, revivals, revolutions, reformations, in other words, an infinite pool of concepts for a new beginning. This multiplicity of discursive and non-discursive factors was essentially what allowed or encouraged different groups of people, from the Athenian intellectuals or even school students, to confirm their allegiance to the national project. Current studies on nationalism and its relation to the past present a fragmented set of conceptual landscapes that cannot easily be mapped onto a single field of understanding. What we are currently in need of is an epistemological approach that helps to bridge the gulf between the older classical debates, with their almost exclusive emphasis on history and causality, with novel departures in the field, which focus on complexity and diversity. UNAMUS adheres to a macroanalytic framework and a causal historical methodology, but also seeks to understand the actions and reactions of the national subjects. This is what I also sought to bring to the fore through my presentation of the exhibition of the Monuments of the Holy Struggle, in hope that I contribute to a more subtle yet rounded account of the formation and development of nations, as well as the appeal of nationalism in late 19th century Greece. Thank you very much.